Hi, thanks for tuning in. This is the US Futures Weekly Chart Analysis for the week ending 1st of August 2025. The first chart is the US dollar index futures, and you can see they moved higher this week. It was quite a strong move for most of the week. Price pushed up and back into the longer term trading range here. Price had been trading quite strongly for most of the week and really only saw some supply drawn out later in the week, mostly on Friday, which caused the close off the week's high. Price does remain within the longer term trading range quite comfortably, really, and the increased spread and above average volume suggests this really was a determined move to push back into this range. We'll see just how the market responds next week. With the supply being drawn out on Friday in particular, you would expect price to come back somewhat in response and test for supply. But the push has been quite strong, and that has been reflected in many of the associated markets, which we'll see shortly. And it does look like a determined effort to regain its position back in the longer term trading range. And we'll see if that's successful over the next few weeks. The next chart is the E-mini S&P. This is S&P 500 index futures. And you can see they've responded in a similar fashion to the strength seen in the US dollar this week. And price pulled back. It is effectively going to test the highs of the range here for strength. And prices come back to this level. It's probably going to test for supply in here, and we'll see whether there's enough strength in the market to maintain its position as an attempted breakout. When markets do push above really important levels like this, they come back and test the breakout for strength about 50% of the time. So this is certainly not unusual, and we'll see over the next week or so whether the market's really got enough strength in there to maintain a new breakout. Next chart is the US Treasury 10-year note futures, and they moved higher this week, which was a good strong move, and it's the highest recent close for some time. Price still remains trading within the range of this widespread down bar, which is effectively a controlling bar at this point in time. Higher bond prices mean lower interest rates. So you can see the interest rates in the US are reducing at this point in time, and the higher close is reflecting that. Volume increased to about average this week, which was supporting the week's gain. So there was no anomaly there. This was a good strong move, and the positive close right up near the week's high suggests it's quite a strong move. Copper price futures. Copper price futures really accelerated lower this week. This is a good example of what happens when the professionals in the market are wrong-footed and find themselves on the wrong side of a trade. They have to unwind themselves. These exaggerated spreads up here when the market was moving higher was the professionals positioning for an event or a news item that they were responding to, and that's obviously not worked out how they expected, and this is the response when they've been caught wrong-footed. They don't always get it right. I know they're known as the smart money, but they don't always get it right, and they've had to really dump positions in the copper price futures market. The prices come back. It's probably going to find this level here as a supporting level, although we'll see, but that's most likely what's going to happen. You can see the close off the week's low suggests this market's probably overshot just a little bit. It's going to settle at this level here. We'll see how it responds next week. I guess that the majority of the volatility would have taken place already, and you'll find the market does tend to stabilise into next week. Gold price futures. Gold price futures saw some weakness emerge last week in here, and the market attempted to move higher but closed lower and closed near the lows of that week. And this week, the market's pulled back and tested the market for supply. It's moved lower and then recovered and closed back up near the highs of the week. These two moves almost counteract each other to a large extent, with weakness coming out and then the market testing for supply. And interestingly, the market closed at a similar level for both weeks. So that's almost neutralised each other to a large degree. And the market does appear pretty comfortable within this range. We'll see if it attempts to move higher now after testing for supply last week. That was almost a mini shakeout, but the market did need to test for supply in response to the previous week's bar where weakness emerged. And you often see that when weakness emerges, the market comes back like that and attempts to consolidate in response. Silver price futures, they also came back this week a little more vigorously. This market does move a little more strongly than the gold price futures. Prices come back to the highs of this range here, and closed almost exactly at it, which was a good effort in the end, because this market can be quite volatile and overshoot its levels to some degree. So that was a good effort. The market came back, and it's effectively testing the strength of this breakout above these highs here. And the close off the week's low does suggest there's a high probability that this will be a successful test of this level, and the market may use it as a springboard to move higher in the weeks to come. Like crude price futures, they attempted to move higher this week in conjunction with the rise in the US dollar, but similarly, supply was drawn out later in the week, which saw a close well off the week's high. I would expect a test for supply in response, like this. And then we'll see, and that may only be for the early part of next week. And then we'll see a true response once we know just how much supply is drawn out. So if increased supply is drawn out, you'll probably see the market move lower or shake out. And if supply is found to be low, then the market may attempt to continue higher. Volume increased to about the average this week. So this was genuine trading, a genuine attempt to push above the recent highs. This is the highs there. And the supply drawn out in response shows you that there is supply in the market and it will need to be tested for sure or absorbed. So either way, the market's probably going to pull back a little early next week. Into the currencies now. This is the Euro-US dollar currency pair, which moved lower this week as the US dollar moved higher. And it did overshoot its levels to some degree. Here's the level you would have expected it to come back to. This is only a minor level down here. It closed off its lows similar to the US dollar index futures closing off its highs. But it did close a little below the level you would have expected price to form an equilibrium at. So this market's just overshot its lows slightly on increased and above average volume. So there was a little bit of dumping in the market there. You may find some weakness emerges. And that may give you a hint that the US dollar will be successful in recovering back into the longer term trading range. We'll have to keep an eye on that. There may be a little hint in that the really quite high volume here suggests that this market has had a slight change in sentiment to some degree and may have seen some of the contracts dumped. Next chart is the British pound currency futures. And they've done a similar thing to the euro. They are joined at the hip to some degree, but they've overshot the level here. Closed well below it. Closed below the lows of that little range as well. So, and the volume was above average and increased. So there's been a Bit of a change in sentiment here in the market, with the US dollar gaining some strength and the euro and the pound looking a little weaker than they have done more recently. We'll see if that's reflected in the other currencies. This is Japanese yen currency futures, and they did move lower, but they've recovered and closed back above the level we marked. In here, we saw the market attempt to recover here, but the close off that week's high shows you that supply was being drawn out. In response, the market's pulled back and then recovered to close back above the lows of that range. So there's been some defence against supply in this market, and it's attempting to hold on above that level. Aussie dollar currency futures, and they've dipped below the lows of this little range we've been marking. It did appear to be bullish absorption, but if that's the case, this market may be failing, or it's going to do a little shakeout here like this. We'll have to wait and see. But at this point, the market has dropped out below the lows of this channel we marked. Volume was increased, but it wasn't above the average. So this may be just reflecting the strength in the US dollar last week. It didn't really close off its lows very much. So this market's just worth keeping an eye on and seeing if it does recover. It had shown some pretty good strength more recently as far as grinding its way higher, but the volumes were a little lowish. If you look down here, they were all pretty much below the average. And that always suggests that when some true supply is drawn out, this market doesn't have any great defence against it, because it's really just floating higher on lower volumes. It's floating higher on a lack of selling pressure. And that's not really a strong way to move if supply is drawn out. So we'll just see how this market trades. A pullback to this level probably wouldn't surprise, through there or there. So this is the range we'd be looking at, finding some support if the weakness does continue. Bitcoin futures. Bitcoin futures traded lower again this week, and it does appear that the market's going to test the highs of the range for strength. That's this level in here. It is worth noting that volumes have reduced over the last 3 weeks, so any supply that has been drawn out is reducing as price moves lower, which is a very good sign of strength for the market in the future. That's showing you that the market's absorbing the supply that has been drawn out in response to the breakout. This is the breakout bar here, and this is the period of consolidation in response. Whether the market actually tags the highs of the range, the dotted line, or not, it really has come back. It's testing that level for strength, and it would appear that this market's going to be successful because supply has reduced, or volume in this case, which is showing you the supply. Supply is reduced this week. It's actually slightly below the average. So you may get a little test for supply early next week or over the weekend, like this. And if supply continues to be low, I expect this market will attempt to push higher in response. If supply is drawn out, you may see the market just dip below this level or even shake out to some degree, like this. But at this point, with the volumes reducing over the last 3 weeks and this week's volume being below the average, the probabilities suggest that selling pressure is reducing, and after testing the highs of the range for strength, there'll be an attempt to push higher in response. Just back to the US dollar index futures quickly. The widespread and increased volume, slightly above average volume, shows the market has made a persistent and determined attempt to recover back into the longer term trading range. Look at the difference between this week's bar and this week's bar, where the market did make a half-hearted attempt to recover, but it didn't really make a move with any underlying strength behind it. Volume was below the average, spread was average to below the average. But then the market tested for supply last week to some degree anyway. It's a bit of an awkward looking test, but that's effectively what was going on. Volume was found to be even lower, and in response, the market's moved higher. And it has drawn out some supply. That's the close off the week's high. So you would almost certainly see some testing for supply in response. We'll see if the market can hold on to both the lows of the overall range, and here's the lows of the recent trading. So the market's made a good, strong attempt to recover, and we'll just see how that goes. Okay, thanks for your time. See you next week. See ya.